The Zenith Collective University occupied an entire moon. Not a small moon, mind you, but one of those properly impressive celestial bodies that had its own weather systems, 3 distinct biomes, and enough gravitational pull to keep your internal organs where they belonged. The institution had been built over the course of 2 centuries by 17 different species, each contributing their own architectural nightmares to the campus. The result was a sprawling academic complex that looked like someone had thrown every geometric shape in the universe into a blender and hit puree. It was by all accounts across known space, the most prestigious center of higher learning in the galaxy. Graduates from Zenith didn't just get jobs, they got appointed to positions that came with titles so long they required their own data storage. The university prided itself on producing diplomats, strategists, and theoretical minds that would shape the future of interstellar relations. Violence, they proclaimed in 17 languages across their marketing materials, was a relic of primitive thinking. Here, conflicts were resolved through discourse, problems through collaborative analysis, and disagreements through strongly worded academic papers that could bore a supernova into submission. The faculty wore their pacifism like a badge of honor. Many had never seen actual combat, never heard the scream of incoming fire, never had to make the kind of split-second decision where all the options were terrible and you just picked the least terrible one. They taught tactical theory the way someone might teach swimming, by describing water without ever getting wet. It was all very civilized, very refined, and utterly divorced from the messy reality of what happened when diplomacy failed and someone decided your existence was negotiable. Professor Kelfram was a prime example of this academic breed. A Voxian with scales that shimmered between blue and silver depending on his emotional state, he had authored 6 books on conflict resolution, served on 14 advisory panels, and held tenure so secure it might as well have been welded to his contract. His advanced tactical theory class was legendary, not because it was particularly useful, but because it was brutally difficult in that special way that academics loved. Theoretical scenarios piled on theoretical responses, all graded on a curve so steep it was practically vertical. The classroom itself was a marvel of unnecessary design, hexagonal, because apparently circles were too mainstream, with holographic displays that could project battle scenarios in 3 dimensions. The seats were arranged in ascending tiers, giving it the feel of an ancient amphitheater where gladiators once fought, except now, the only thing dying was students' will to live through another 4-hour lecture on the philosophical implications of defensive posturing. It was 3rd period on a galactic standard Tuesday, which meant absolutely nothing to most of the species present since nobody could agree on what a day should be. When the door slid open 14 minutes after class had started, the human walked in like she owned the place. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not the fact that she was late, though Professor Kelfram's scales immediately flushed toward crimson at that particular slight. Not even that she was human, though that was certainly noteworthy since humans were relatively new to the collective and still carried that faint air of unpredictability that made other species nervous. No, what everyone noticed was the armor. Full combat plating, matte black with scoring marks that spoke of actual use rather than ceremonial display. The kind of armor that had seen things, done things, and kept its wearer alive through experiences that would require therapy to fully unpack. It covered her from neck to boots, segmented plates that moved with practiced ease, magnetic locks at the joints humming with the remitted, faint sound of active power cells. On her hip, conspicuously absent, was the holster space for a weapon, empty per university regulations but present enough to remind everyone it existed. She moved to an empty seat in the middle tier without apology, the armor's servo assists making her footsteps heavier than they should be. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent classroom. Professor Kelfram's scales went full crimson. "You're late." "Traffic," she replied, settling into the seat designed for beings considerably less armored. The chair protested with a metallic groan. "And you're in violation of the university dress code." Kelfram's voice had that particular tone that academics used when they'd found a rule to hide behind. Section 4, subsection C clearly states that students must wear appropriate academic attire, Combat armor hardly qualifies. Around the classroom, various alien species perked up with interest. A Terre-Nine, all four eyes focusing independently, leaned forward. A cluster of Vexari began that clicking communication they did when something entertaining was about to happen. Even the Krethax students, 3 of them scattered through the tiers, seemed to shrink slightly in their seats. The human looked at Kelfram with an expression that was difficult to read through a helmet's faceplate. The code says appropriate attire. This is appropriate for me. It's intimidating to other students, Kelfram pressed, sensing weakness. Several students nodded, emboldened by their professor's stance. It creates an atmosphere of hostility in what should be a space of learning and theoretical exploration. Theoretical, the human repeated, and there was something in her tone that made it sound like an insult. Remove the armor, or remove yourself from my class. The classroom held its collective breath. This was the kind of standoff that would be discussed in dining halls for weeks. Professor versus student, establishment versus newcomer, civilization versus whatever humans represented in the minds of species who'd been spacefaring for millennia before Earth figured out agriculture. The human sat still for a long moment, then she reached up and released the seal on her helmet. The hiss of equalizing pressure seemed unreasonably loud. She was younger than the armor suggested, maybe mid-20s in human years, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation braid and eyes that had seen too much for that face. She set the helmet on the desk beside her with care that suggested it was worth more than most students' tuition. All of it, Kelfram said, pressing his advantage. His scales had shifted to a satisfied purple. University policy. Around the room, students watched with varying degrees of interest and smugness. The Terre-Nine was practically vibrating with second-hand superiority. A Yolian, species known for their delicate sensibilities and 3 centuries without a single act of violence, actually smiled, which was concerning because Yolians had too many teeth for smiling to be comforting. The human started with the gauntlets, each one sealed with magnetic locks that responded to her fingerprints. They came off with metallic clicks that punctuated the silence. Her hands underneath were scarred, the kind of scarring that came from thermal burns, the flesh healing in ways that left patterns like topographical maps of trauma. The Terre-Nine's interest faltered slightly. Next came the chest plate, segmented pieces that unlocked in sequence. The human worked with practiced efficiency, someone who'd done this thousands of times, in different situations, under different circumstances. Some of those circumstances, judging by the speed, had probably involved people shooting at her. As each piece came off, more skin was revealed. And more scars. They weren't the neat, surgical scars of medical procedures gone right. These were combat scars, the kind that came from survival rather than treatment. Burn patterns from energy weapons ran up both arms like twisted vines. On her left shoulder, a patch of scar tissue so extensive it looked like someone had tried to melt her, and she'd simply refused to cooperate. The classroom's temperature seemed to drop. The human continued disassembling her armor with the same methodical calm, stacking pieces on her desk like she was unpacking groceries. Shoulder guards revealed more burns. Leg plates exposed scars that ran from ankle to knee on both legs. Each new piece of armor removed was another revelation of damage survived, pain endured, and somehow, impossibly, life continued. By the time she got to the underlayer, a thin tactical shirt designed to interface with armor systems, the only sound in the room was her breathing and the faint hum of the holographic displays. She peeled the shirt off. The silence became deafening. Her torso was a canvas of violence survived. Plasma burns, the distinctive flowering pattern unmistakable to anyone who'd studied weapons theory even in passing, covered her ribs. More burns ran up her spine, visible when she turned to fold the shirt. Her neck, previously hidden by the armor's high collar, showed scarring that suggested she'd been caught in an explosion and decided to walk away from it anyway. Professor Kelfram had gone completely white, a Voxian stress response that indicated imminent panic. One of the Krethax students made a sound like a strangled wheeze. The human pulled the tactical shirt back on, didn't bother with the armor, and sat back down. She looked at Kelfram with an expression that was perfectly polite and absolutely terrifying in its calmness. "Better?" she asked. Nobody answered. The Threnian had stopped vibrating. The Yolian's smile had vanished, which was a relief because those teeth were nightmare fuel. Even the other human students in the class, 3 of them scattered through the tiers, were staring with recognition that bordered on reverence. Kelfram opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Those are plasma burns. The human supplied helpfully. Mostly. The ones on my legs are from a building collapse. The shoulder is from shrapnel when our defense battery took a direct hit and I was standing too close. She said it conversationally, like she was discussing the weather or maybe a mildly interesting vacation. You wanted to discuss tactical theory today, right? Chapter 9, Defensive Strategies Against Numerically Superior Forces. Yes. Kelfram seemed to be rebooting his brain in real time. Great. So these scars are from the Krethax incursion. Some of you might remember that one. She looked directly at the 3 Krethax students, who were actively trying to phase through their seats into another dimension. It was about 6 years ago. You probably learned about it as the failed expansion or maybe the Terre-Nine miscalculation, depending on which propaganda your government was serving that decade. One of the Krethax, braver or more foolish than his companions, spoke up. That was a military conflict. Soldiers fought that battle. The human laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that suggested she'd found something deeply, darkly funny about the universe and was no longer surprised by its capacity for irony. Soldiers, she repeated. Sure. Eventually soldiers showed up. 6 days eventually. You want to know what I was before your species decided Terre-Nine looked like easy pickings? She didn't wait for an answer. I was a teacher. Primary education, ages 6 to 12 human years. I taught mathematics and basic science. My biggest concern was whether I had enough art supplies for the end-of-term project. The classroom had somehow become even quieter, which shouldn't have been physically possible. Then your battleship showed up, she continued, voice still in that conversational tone that was somehow worse than shouting. Bypassed all diplomatic channels, ignored the 3 separate attempts at communication, and opened fire on civilian population centers because your strategic doctrine said that humans would fold under immediate pressure. She rolled her left shoulder, the one with the extensive scarring. Spoiler alert, we didn't. Professor Kelfram had given up on regaining control of the class. He'd sat down at his desk and was staring at the human with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was being violently reassessed. The plasma burns on my arms, the human said, holding them up like she was presenting evidence in court, are from when I pulled 17 children out of a burning school. The building was hit in the first wave, and your ground forces assumed anyone inside was dead. They were wrong. The burns on my ribs are from holding a defensive position at the colony's main shelter for 4 days straight, while your soldiers tried to breach it. They didn't. She pointed to her neck. This one's my favorite. One of your warriors, and I use that term loosely because he panicked like an amateur, threw a plasma grenade into the shelter's entrance. It detonated early. I was standing in the doorway. The blast should have killed me. She smiled, and it was absolutely not friendly. I caught the majority of it with my body and shielded 8 people behind me. Then I shot him. Then I shot his 6 companions. Then I used their weapons to hold the entrance for another 16 hours until our actual military arrived. The Krethax students looked like they wanted to melt into the floor. The thing about humans, she said, addressing the entire class now, is that we don't have a surrender reflex like most species. It's not that we're particularly brave or stupid, though we can be both. It's that our evolutionary history was so consistently terrible that fight to the death became the default setting. You know what we called the Krethax incursion on Terre-Nine? Nobody answered. Tuesday. That got a reaction. Shocked inhalation from multiple species. One strangled sound from the Yolian and from the other human students. Grim nods of agreement. Because it wasn't special, she continued. It wasn't some unprecedented horror. It was just another Tuesday where something tried to kill us, and we declined the invitation. You want to know the funny part? The Krethax thought they were being overwhelming. 3 battleships, 15,000 ground troops, full orbital bombardment, against a colony of 12,000 civilians on a world with no military installation. She leaned back in her chair, the scars on her arms, catching the light from the holographic displays. They had every advantage. Superior numbers, superior firepower, complete surprise, and a battle plan that had worked on 17 other worlds. You know what they didn't account for? Professor Kelthrim, despite himself, asked, "What?" "That we'd win anyway." The human pulled up her own datapad, ignoring the armor still stacked on her desk. Chapter 9 discusses defensive strategies against numerically superior forces. It focuses on static defenses, prepared positions, and delaying actions until reinforcement. It's all very theoretical. Very clean. Want to know what actually works? She didn't wait for permission, just started talking. And despite everything, every student in the room started taking notes. First, you make them bleed for every meter, not figuratively. Literally. You make the cost so high that even victory feels like defeat. The Krethax took 3 days to advance 15 kilometers through Terre-Nine's primary settlement. That's slower than infantry can walk. We made them pay for every building, every street, every stupid meter of ground they thought they'd conquered. Her fingers flew over the datapad, pulling up statistics that definitely weren't in the official textbook. Second, you never let them rest. Sleep deprivation is the great equalizer. We had civilians, remember, not trained soldiers. But civilians can make a noise, can shoot randomly into the dark, can convince an enemy that nowhere is safe. The Krethax got maybe 4 hours of actual rest over those 6 days. Their decision-making deteriorated accordingly. One of the non-Krethax students raised a tentacle. But the psychological cost to your own people was irrelevant compared to survival, the human cut in. You're thinking like someone who has the luxury of choosing peace. When someone is actively trying to exterminate you, psychology takes a back seat to not being dead. We sang during the bombardments, not because we were happy, because it made them think we were insane. And scared people make mistakes. She pulled up another file, casualty reports that made several students flinch. Third, you use their assumptions against them. The Krethax assumed we'd protect our civilians at any cost, so we put civilians in armor, gave them weapons, and sent them into combat positions while actual fighters moved through areas the Krethax had already cleared. They kept calling for reinforcements to areas they'd already taken because they couldn't believe we'd actually counterattack with non-combatants. That's a war crime, someone objected. The human smile was sharp enough to cut. Only if you lose. Besides, I seem to recall the Krethax initiated hostilities against a civilian population without declaration of war. That's also a war crime. The collective didn't seem particularly concerned then. Silence greeted that observation. By day 4, she continued, pulling up tactical maps, the Krethax had achieved all their initial objectives. They held every strategic position, every major structure, every landing pad. And they were losing. Because holding ground means nothing if you can't rest, can't resupply safely, can't move without being shot at from 3 directions. Their casualty rate was 60% by the time our military arrived. Ours was 42%, and half of those survived because we had more people who knew first aid than we had people who knew combat medicine. Professor Kelthrim finally found his voice. And your military? When they arrived, cleaned up the remaining Krethax forces in 18 hours, she said simply. Because by then, the enemy was exhausted, demoralized, and absolutely terrified. Humans with actual military training are considerably worse than armed civilians. The Krethax survivors surrendered so fast our commanders thought it might be a trap. She looked at the 3 Krethax students again. It wasn't, by the way. Your people just finally understood what every predator on Earth learned over millions of years. Sometimes the prey fights back. And when it does, maybe you picked the wrong prey. One of the Krethax, to his credit, spoke up. We were taught that Terre-Nine was a tragedy of miscommunication. That your people's aggressive response violated collective protocols. The human's laugh was bitter. Miscommunication. Right. The 3 ignored diplomatic hails were what? A technological glitch. The orbital bombardment of civilian centers was filed under "oops my bad." And my favorite part of that particular lie: we violated protocols by defending ourselves too effectively. She stood up, started putting her armor back on. The class watched in silence as each piece locked into place, covering the scars, hiding the evidence of survival. "Here's what your sanitized history won't tell you," she said, sealing the chestplate. The Krethax incursion failed not because of military intervention, not because of technological superiority, not because of any of the factors your textbooks claim. It failed because 12,000 human civilians decided that dying on their feet was preferable to living on their knees, and we made that decision expensive enough that your entire species reconsidered the cost-benefit analysis of attacking humans. The gauntlets locked on with sharp clicks. After Terre-Nine, how many human colonies have been attacked? Nobody answered, but everyone knew. 0. In 6 years, not a single hostile force had attempted another invasion of human territory. "That's not because we joined the collective," she said, locking the helmet into place. Her voice came through the speakers now, slightly distorted but perfectly clear. "It's because every species that knows anything about warfare looked at what happened on Terre-Nine and decided that maybe, just maybe, humans weren't worth the trouble." She picked up her datapad, checking the time. "So when you demand I remove my armor because it makes people uncomfortable, what you're really saying is that evidence of survival makes you uncomfortable. That being reminded of violence makes you uncomfortable. That having to acknowledge the galaxy isn't all diplomatic solutions and theoretical discussions makes you uncomfortable." The human turned to face Professor Kelfram directly. "I wear this armor because I earned it. Every scar underneath it is a lesson about what happens when civilization fails and theory meets reality. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Comfort is a luxury built on the backs of people who did uncomfortable things to ensure you got to keep philosophizing about the proper way to handle conflicts." Kelfram opened his mouth, but one of the other human students stood up, then another. The third remained seated but pulled off their jacket, revealing burn scars running up their left arm. "New Canada colony," the first human said simply. "Yolian pirate attack, 48-hour siege before relief arrived. Epsilon Station," the second added. "Hull breach during Vexari territory dispute, held pressure suits together with tape and spike for 11 hours. The third just raised their scarred arm. No explanation needed. The human in armor nodded to them, a gesture of recognition between people who shared something the rest of the class could only theorize about. She turned back to Kelfram. "So yes, Professor, I'm in violation of your dress code, and I'm going to continue violating it, because this armor is my academic attire. It's my thesis on defensive theory, my dissertation on survival tactics, and my credentials that I actually know what I'm teaching when you inevitably ask me to guest lecture, because suddenly theoretical discussions don't seem quite as valuable." The bell chimed, signaling the end of class. Nobody moved. "Dismissed," Kelfram said quietly. Students filed out slowly, many casting glances back at the armored human and her compatriots. The Krethax students tried to slip out quickly, but the armored human's voice stopped them. "Hey." They froze. "Hey. Your textbooks call it the failed incursion," she said, voice casual through the helmet speakers. "We call it the Terre-Nine stand. Just so you know what to search for if you want the actual casualty reports, instead of the sanitized versions." The Krethax nodded and fled. Professor Kelfram remained at his desk, looking at the human who had effectively commandeered his class for the last hour. "That was quite the lecture." "You wanted tactical theory," she replied. "I gave you tactics. The theory is that everything works perfectly on paper. The reality is that paper burns. The university will have questions about this. The university can submit them in writing." She headed for the door, the other human students falling in beside her. "Oh, and Professor, Chapter 9 needs a rewrite. The section on psychological warfare is particularly outdated." After they left, Kelfram sat in the empty classroom for a long time, looking at the holographic displays showing sanitized battle scenarios that suddenly seemed very insufficient. 3 weeks later, The Zenith Collective University quietly amended its dress code policies. Combat armor was now classified as cultural expression for species with military service traditions. The change was buried in administrative updates and never officially announced. Professor Kelfram's Advanced Tactical Theory class underwent significant restructuring. Guest lectures from human veterans became mandatory components. Enrollment in his class increased by 300%, mostly students who'd heard about what happened and wanted to learn from someone who'd actually survived what they were studying. The human in armor continued attending classes, though she never had to remove the armor again. Her name became something of a legend on campus, whispered by students who wanted to sound knowledgeable about real combat versus theoretical scenarios. The irony wasn't lost on anyone with functioning brain cells. The same institution that had demanded civilization and decorum, that had prided itself on diplomatic solutions and theoretical excellence, was now scrambling to learn from the barbarians they'd looked down upon. Because when theory meets reality and reality wins, the smart money learns from the survivors. And humans, as the galaxy was slowly, reluctantly learning, were very good at surviving. The armored human started teaching her own class the following semester. Applied defensive tactics for theoretically impossible scenarios. It filled up in 17 minutes. The waiting list had 400 names. Turns out, when you teach people how to survive the unsurvivable, they tend to pay attention, even if it makes them uncomfortable. Especially if it makes them uncomfortable.